Welcome back to Inside the Philippines. I'm glad you're here. Today's story is a little different from what we usually bring you. No catastrophic financial loss. No one cleaned out. No visa nightmare. No deportation. No court case. What we have instead is something rarer. A man who saw the situation developing, said nothing, and then did something most men never think to do. He built a test, quietly, carefully, the way he'd built things his whole working life. And then he waited to see what the results would tell him. His name is Brendan. He's 63 years old, retired, from Limerick in the west of Ireland. 40 years as a scaffolder. Not the kind of man who talks about himself much, which is part of why it took us a while to get his story. But he agreed to share it, because he thinks it might be useful to someone. That's how he put it, useful. You'll understand why that word matters to him once you hear what he's been through. What happened to Brendan in the Philippines didn't break him, but it showed him something he needed to see. And the way he chose to find out, that's the part that's going to stay with you. Here's his story, in his own words. I'll start at the beginning, which is not the Philippines. The beginning is a terraced house on Rosebryan Road in Limerick, and a woman named Meyer, and 31 years of a life that suited us both well enough. I started scaffolding when I was 22, followed a fella from the road into it. That's how you ended up in a trade back then. Someone brought you in. First job was a factory site out near Shannon. Cold morning March, ground still hard. I remember thinking I'd last a week. I lasted 40 years. I'm not telling you that to make myself sound impressive. I'm telling you because the job becomes who you are, after long enough. You think in terms of structures, what holds, what doesn't, where the load goes, whether the thing you're looking at will bear the weight you need it to bear. Meyer got sick in 2018, ovarian cancer. They found it at a routine appointment, which is the word they use, routine, as if there's anything routine about that conversation. We were told it was serious. We understood what that meant, though we didn't say it to each other for a while. That's an Irish thing, maybe. You carry the information before you speak it out loud. For the first 2 years, she was still herself, mostly. She had the treatment. She had good periods and bad ones. I drove her to appointments, made the dinners. I kept the garden tidy because she liked the garden tidy. I retired from the sites in 2020. I'd been meaning to anyway. That was what I told myself and what I told her. She didn't argue because she needed me home, and we both knew it. The last 18 months were different. I'll not go into it in detail. I slept in a chair beside her hospital bed more nights than I slept in my own house. The nurses were good. Everyone was good. It didn't matter. She passed in September 2022, and I drove home from the hospital at 4:30 in the morning and sat at the kitchen table until it got bright and didn't know what to do with my hands. I sold the house 7 months later. We'd owned it outright since 2009, no mortgage. The estate agent gave me a figure, and I sat across from him and nodded and thought, yes, fine, whatever you think. But I walked out with a check for just over 158,000 euros and stood on the pavement outside his office in the rain, and I hadn't a notion what I was supposed to do next. With the money. With the day, with any of it. I moved into a flat off the Ennis Road. 2 bedrooms, more space than I needed. The money went into a savings account where it sat and generated a modest amount of interest and otherwise just sat there. I know people talk about money as freedom, as options opening up. To me, it just felt like something I hadn't earned. Like someone had handed me a set of tools for a job I didn't have. I wasn't lonely. Or, I don't think that's the right word. I know what loneliness is. Loneliness is when you want company, and there's none. What I had was something different. I was unoccupied. Every morning I woke up, and there was no particular reason to get up at any specific time. No sight, no appointments, no one needing anything. For a man who spent his life being useful, that is, it's its own kind of bad. Harder to explain than loneliness. Harder to fix. I watched a lot of television. I walked. I started going to the library, which I hadn't done since I was a teenager. I read books about things I didn't know anything about. I was okay. I just wasn't anything in particular. My nephew Ciaran came home for Christmas that year. He works in tech, lives in Dublin now. One of those jobs where you're not entirely sure what he does, but it involves a laptop and seems to pay well. We were sitting around my sister's table in Ennis, the good plates out, the usual. Someone had asked Ciaran about whether he'd been anywhere good, and he started talking about Southeast Asia. He'd been to Thailand, Vietnam, the Philippines. He said the Philippines almost in passing. Grand spot. Cheap as chips. Lovely people. Weather's mad, but you get used to it. Something like that. I don't know why it landed the way it did. Maybe because it was the first thing in months that had made me pick my head up slightly. I didn't ask him much about it at the dinner table, but I remembered it. In January, the insomnia started in properly. I've never been a great sleeper, but the early months of 2023 were bad. 2, 3 in the morning, sitting in the kitchen with the radio low, not reading, just awake. One night I typed the Philippines into YouTube and started watching. I'm not sure what I expected. What I found were these channels, men around my age, talking about retiring there, the cost of living, the weather, the visa situation. It was practical in a way I responded to, not romantic, not selling you a dream, just information. Here's what a decent apartment costs. Here's how the visa works. Here's what the food is like day to day. I watched for 3 hours that first night. Then I went to bed. Then the next night, I watched more. I got a notebook, a plain one from Eason's, and started writing things down. Visa types, average rents in Cebu, healthcare costs, the Irish embassy in Manila, in case it was needed, exchange rates, what your money gets you there versus what it gets you here. I'd done this same thing 100 times on jobs. Gather the information first. Assess the load. I'd work out if the structure can hold it before you commit anyone to it. It's the only sensible approach. In February, I booked 3 weeks in Cebu for March. Return flights, no accommodation sorted yet, just the flights. I told my sister I was taking a holiday. I told Ciaran the same. They seemed relieved, probably, that I was doing something. Neither of them asked too many questions, which was good, because I didn't have answers that would have satisfied anyone. It was a holiday. That's what I told them, and that's what I told myself, which was, look, it was mostly true. I want to be fair to myself on this. I wasn't flying out there with an agenda, but I also wasn't entirely flying out there with no agenda. I was flying out there to see if there was something, a place, a life, something. That might give me a reason to get up at a specific time again. Whether that counted as a holiday depended on who you asked. I booked a guest house near the IT park in Cebu. Nothing fancy. Clean, decent shower, air conditioning that worked. 23 euros a night, which felt faintly surreal. I packed light. I flew out on a Wednesday in March and arrived into Mactan Airport on Thursday evening, the heat hitting you like something physical when you step off the plane. The whole car journey into the city I was watching out the window. The traffic it's unlike anything you'd see in Ireland. Tricycles and jeepneys and people on motorbikes with 3 passengers. and noise, and everywhere you look, there's something happening. I'd been warned about it on the YouTube channels. Still, I wasn't enchanted. Not immediately. And I was jet-lagged and slightly overwhelmed and quietly wondering what exactly I thought I was doing here. But I didn't turn around. And by day 4, I'd found my rhythm. Day 5, I walked down toward Colon Street. I was looking for somewhere quiet to eat. I found somewhere quiet. That was where I met Joy. The place had no sign outside that I could read. A hand-painted board above the door with something in Cebuano. A picture of a bowl. 3 plastic tables inside. A ceiling fan. A counter. It smelled of garlic and something frying in oil. There were 2 other customers, both local men eating with their heads down. Nobody looked up when I came in. That suited me fine. Joy was at the till. Not waiting tables, just standing at the counter doing something with a receipt book. Not especially interested in the door opening. She was 34. I'd find out later. Small, dark-haired, wearing a plain uniform the color of pale green. She glanced up, didn't smile. Looked back at the receipt book. One stood there for a moment because there was no menu I could see. I said, "Excuse me, what do you have?" She pointed at a board on the wall behind her. The same Cebuano writing, which told me nothing. I said, "I'm sorry. Could you tell me in English?" She did. Pork adobo, sinigang, rice, fried chicken. I said I'd have the adobo and rice, and sat down at the table nearest the door. That was the whole of it. She brought the food. I ate it. I paid. The adobo was good, proper good. None of that watered-down version. Just pork and vinegar and soy and garlic, dark and strong. I remember thinking I'd come back for that alone. I did come back. The next day and the day after. On the 3rd day, I ordered the sinigang, which came with fish and tamarind broth, and a pile of vegetables, sour and hot. And I burned my tongue on it because I forgot how hot they serve things. The same 2 men were eating at the same table both times. Maybe they lived there. Maybe I was becoming one of them. The 4th visit, she asked, without looking up from what she was doing where I was from. I said Ireland. She said she'd never met anyone from Ireland before. I said there aren't many of us out this way. She nodded and went back to the receipt book. That was the conversation. But I kept coming back. And somewhere around the 6th or 7th visit, she started talking a bit more. Not a lot. She wasn't a person who performed small talk. You could see that. But during a quiet period, she'd lean against the counter, and we'd exchange a few sentences. She told me her name was Joy, which felt almost too on the nose, and I nearly said so, and then decided that wasn't the kind of humor that would land. She told me she was from Bohol originally, that she'd come to Cebu for work when she was 22 and hadn't gone back except for visits. I asked what was in Bohol, and she said her family, her mother, her brother, Roel, who was studying engineering at a university in Cebu. She'd helped get him set up there, found him a boarding house near the campus in Mandaue, helped him register. She sent 8,000 pesos home to her mother every month. She said this the same way she might tell me the adobo came with rice. Just a fact. Part of the arrangement of her life. Her father had died when she was 19. Your heart attack, no warning, no prior illness. One morning, he was there. And that was it. She said this without the weight I'd have expected. And it took me a moment to understand that she'd had 15 years to make her peace with it. She'd been carrying the family since then, just got on with it. I recognized something in that. I won't pretend I didn't. There's a type of person, and I've worked alongside them for decades, who just absorbs what's required of them and gets on. No fuss, no martyrdom, no expectation of credit. They're often quieter than everyone else, because the people who make the most noise about their problems are usually the ones carrying the least. Myra had been like that. I'd tried to be. Joy struck me the same way. Now look, I know what you're thinking. I know how that sounds, sitting here telling you this. But I'm not going to pretend I was some innocent man with no idea what he was walking into. I was 63 years old. I'd watched the YouTube videos. I'd read the forums. I knew the broad outlines of how these things could go. There are whole categories of how it goes wrong in the Philippines, and plenty of fellas willing to tell you about each of them in detail. I just thought, and I want to be honest about this, I just thought she didn't fit the shape of it. She wasn't warm in the way I'd been warned about. She wasn't available. She didn't ask me anything about my life in Ireland, or how much I had put away, or whether I was planning to stay. She served me food, and we talked when there was nothing else happening, and she treated me like a person who ate lunch there, which is what I was. There's something in that, and if you're a man of a certain age and disposition, that gets under your skin more than any amount of charm would. On my last evening in Cebu, the Tuesday, I was flying out Wednesday morning, I went back to the restaurant. I'd been in the city nearly 3 weeks by then. I'd walked most of it, taken a few jeepneys out to places I'd read about, sat on a wall above the Mac-10 channel, and watched the container ships. I'd done what I'd come to do, which was have a look and see if the structure could hold weight. My overall verdict was undecided. I ate the adobo one more time. When I went to pay, Joy was putting something into a small notebook. I noticed she kept one at the counter, and I thought about my own notebook in the flat in Limerick, and the lists I'd made. She told me what I owed. I paid. I said I was going home tomorrow. She said, "Oh." There was a pause that was not quite awkward. Then she tore a piece of paper from the notebook and wrote her WhatsApp number and put it on the counter and said, "If you come back." Not call me sometime, not keep in touch, just if you come back. I put the number in my pocket and said goodnight. On the flight home, Dublin via Doha, 15 hours, too much time to think, I was fairly sure I wouldn't message her. That's the truth. I thought it was a few conversations with a woman at a restaurant counter. She was pleasant. The food was good. That's the whole of it. You're 63 years old, Brendan. Go home. Sort yourself out. Stop making stories out of nothing. I landed in Dublin on a grey Thursday morning, drove back down to Limerick in rain, let myself into the flat, put the kettle on. 2 days later, I sent her a message. I said I was home safe, and the adobo was better in her place than anything I'd find in Limerick. I thought that was a reasonable thing to send, neutral, just a note to a person I'd met. She replied within the hour. She said she was glad I'd arrived safely, and that if I came back, she'd teach me to make adobo properly, which apparently I'd been eating wrong without knowing it. That made me laugh. Sitting alone in the flat off the Ennis Road, I laughed out loud at that. It's a strange thing, noticing when that happens. When you laugh properly at something. I'd forgotten a bit what it felt like. By the following week, we were talking every evening. The calls started small. That's the thing I'd want anyone listening to this to understand. There was no moment where I sat down and decided to begin sending money to a woman in the Philippines. It happened the way water finds its way through a wall, not through any single crack, just gradually, until one day you notice the floor is wet. The first few weeks were just talking. She'd call. Well, no, she never called first. I'd call her. Every evening around 7:30 Limerick time, which was 3:15 in the morning her side, early morning before her shift. She'd be in her room, sometimes eating, sometimes just sitting. Small room. She'd told me she rented it from a family in a house off Leon Kilat Street. I could see a crucifix on the wall behind her, a small fan on a shelf, a bag hanging from a hook on the door. It never changed. The background was always exactly the same. I noticed that, actually. Some of the forums I'd read before going out, the fellas on there would say, watch the background on the video calls. If it keeps changing, if she seems to be in different places, that's something to note. Joy's background never changed. At the time, I took that as a good sign. She was where she said she was, living the life she'd described. Consistent. I still think that's probably true. I want to be fair about that. We talked about everything and not very much. She'd tell me about her day at the restaurant. I'd tell her about nothing in particular. What I'd watched, what I'd read, whether it had rained. It had usually rained. She found this funny, the amount of rain in Ireland. She said she'd never seen real cold, that Cebu in December was still warm enough to sit outside. I said I couldn't imagine that. She said she couldn't imagine the opposite. It was the pleasantest part of my day. I'll just say that plainly. In May, this was about 6 weeks after I'd come home, she mentioned on a call that the pharmacy near her work had put up the price of her mother's blood pressure medication. Not in a leading way. It came up as part of a longer thing she was saying about her mother's last checkup. The doctor had adjusted the dose slightly, the new prescription cost more, the pharmacy she usually used had changed their prices. She said she'd have to figure something out. Then she moved on to something else. I said, hold on, how much is it? She said, 3,200 pesos a month. About 53 euros at the rate then. I said, I'll send it. She said, no, it's not your... I said, I'll send it, it's fine. She went quiet for a moment. Then she said, thank you. She said it quietly. Like it had cost her something to accept. I had to learn GCash to do it. It's a Filipino mobile payments app. You register, link your bank, and you can send money to a phone number in the Philippines. Took me an hour and a half the first time, including a call to my bank to explain what I was doing. The woman on the phone from AIB asked I sure about this? I said, yes, I'm sure. It's medication for an elderly woman, thank you very much. That was the extent of the scrutiny. 3,200 pesos a month. 53 euro. On a state pension of about 1,200 euros a month, and the house money sitting doing nothing in the account? It was nothing. I'm not going to pretend I agonized over it. I didn't. If my sister had rung me and said she needed 53 euros a month for something important, I'd have said fine without a second thought. I set it up as a regular transfer, same day each month. Didn't mention it to Joy after that, and she didn't make a thing of it. That suited us both. Then August. Roel's university fees were due for the next term. Joy mentioned it the same way she'd mentioned the medication. As a fact, a problem in her life that she was working through. She was short. She'd been putting money aside, but she'd had to send extra home in July because her mother had needed a visit to a specialist. And the timing was difficult. The fees were 18,000 pesos for the semester. Roughly 290 euros. I sent it through GCash the next morning. She thanked me on the call that evening. She said she felt bad accepting it. I said don't. I said her brother getting his engineering degree was a good thing in the world, and I was glad to help it happen. She said she'd pay me back when she could. I said that's not necessary. She didn't argue further. And look, I want to stop here for a moment, because I know how this sounds when I lay it out in sequence. I know it sounds like a pattern. And in hindsight, of course it is. But you have to understand what each individual amount felt like at the time. 53 euro a month is a round of drinks. 290 euro for a semester of university fees is, I don't know, a decent pair of work boots. On their own, in the moment, they were not alarming numbers. Not to a man with 158,000 euros in the bank. The motorbike repair was the following month, September. Roel's bike had a problem. He used it to get from his boarding house in Mandaue to campus. Joy explained. It was essential. He couldn't afford the grab fares every day on top of everything else. The mechanic was quoting 6,500 pesos, about 104 euros. I sent it. If you're keeping count, he and I wasn't at the time, across 7 months from April to October I'd sent the medication monthly, 6 payments of 3,200 pesos, which is 19,200 pesos. The university fees, 18,000 pesos. The motorbike repair, 6,500 pesos. Total somewhere around 43,700 pesos. Roughly 700 euros. Which, added to the flights I'd taken to get there in March, brought my total investment in whatever this was to somewhere around 1,400 euros or so at that point, not counting what I'd spent on food and accommodation in Cebu during the visit itself. I didn't add it up. That's not an excuse. It's just what happened. Each amount was a separate decision in response to a specific situation. There was no standing order to a woman in the Philippines. There were just a few things that had come up, that I'd been in a position to help with, that I had. None of it was asked for directly. That's the thing I keep coming back to. She never once said, "Brendan, I need money." Every single amount was mentioned first as a problem, a situation, a fact of her life. The asking, if you can call it that, was done by indirection. And I don't know. Even now, I don't know whether that was calculated or whether it was just how she'd learned to navigate things. Maybe both. Maybe it started as one and became the other. I genuinely don't know. I didn't tell anyone at home what was happening. Not my sister. Not Ciaran. I told myself it was because I didn't want to explain something I didn't fully understand myself, which was true as far as it went. There was also the other thing, the Irish thing, where you don't speak of something until you know what it is. Putting words to it made it real, made it a thing that could be judged. And I wasn't ready for that. In September, I booked a return flight to Cebu for October. I told my sister I was going back to the Philippines. She said, "Oh," and then was quiet for a moment, and then said, "Will you be careful?" I said, "I'll be fine." Neither of us said anything else about it. I got on the plane in Dublin on a Tuesday morning with a return ticket for 2.5 weeks, and a feeling I didn't have a name for. Not excitement exactly. Something more careful than excitement. More like when you're about to find out whether something you've built is sound. She was there when I came through the arrivals gate. That was the first thing. I want you to understand why that mattered to me specifically, because I think to some people it wouldn't. You'd expect your girlfriend to meet you at the airport. That's just what you do. But I'm not someone who expects things. I'd half prepared myself, on the flight, for a message saying she'd been held up at work. Something had come up. She'd meet me at the guest house. I'd prepared a response to that, which would have been fine and unconcerned, because that's how I handle things. She was there. Plain blue dress, flat sandals, hair tied back. Holding nothing, no sign with my name on it, just standing with her arms at her sides, looking at the arrivals gate with the same expression she had behind the counter in the restaurant. Not performing waiting, just waiting. I said, "It's good to see you." She said, "You made it." That was how we greeted each other after 7 months of every evening phone calls, and I thought, yes, that's the right register. That's the right amount of a thing. We took a grab from Mactan into the city. So she sat beside me in the back seat and we talked about the flight. How long? Was the food terrible? Did I sleep? Normal things. The driver had the radio on low, some Filipino pop song. Outside the window, Cebu was doing what Cebu does. Motorcycles threading through gaps that didn't exist. A jeepney painted bright yellow with a saint on the side panel. A woman selling boiled peanuts from a cart at a red light. The air through the window was warm and smelled of diesel and something frying somewhere. I'd forgotten how immediate it all was, how loud without being overwhelming, once you knew the register of it. She'd taken 2 days off work. This mattered to her. She told me she'd had to ask the manager twice, that they were short-staffed, that she'd swapped shifts with someone to make it work. 2 days off was not a small thing. I didn't say much about it, just noted it. The first day we went down to a beach resort south of the city, out past the South Road properties. One of those places, nice enough, not expensive. A strip of pale sand, plastic sun loungers, a bar selling San Miguel and fresh buko juice. The sea was warm and green, and there were children playing in the shallows about 30 meters away. I am not a man who does much at beaches normally. I sat in the shade, and she sat beside me, and we talked, on and off, for most of the afternoon. She told me more about Bohol, about what it was like growing up there. The quietness of it compared to Cebu, the church in the town she was from, which was apparently very old, and had survived earthquakes that had taken everything else. She said her family went to Mass there every Sunday without exception, that even when she was a teenager and didn't particularly want to go, her mother simply left without her, and somehow that was worse. I understood that, the quiet withdrawal of expectation as a form of pressure. Irish Catholic mothers had the same technique. 2 days later, she brought me to Sunday Mass at the Basilica Minore del Santo Niño, which is this old church near Colon. Old by Philippine standards, which means genuinely old. Built in the 1500s. Thick stone walls, dark inside, smell of candle wax and incense. The Mass was in Filipino, which I followed none of, but the rhythm of it is the same everywhere. Stand, sit, kneel. I hadn't been to Mass in years. After Mary died, I'd stopped. I hadn't made a decision about it. It had just lapsed. But I went without complaint that Sunday, and stood and sat and knelt at the right times, and the strangeness of doing a familiar thing in an unfamiliar language was, I don't know, not uncomfortable, something else, something I didn't examine too closely. The third day, she brought me to a friend's apartment in a building near the Ayala Center, Cebu, to cook. The friend, a woman named Maricel, was apparently visiting family in Dumaguete for the week. Joy had a key. The apartment was small and tidy, a kitchenette, a single window looking onto another building. She made adobo, proper adobo, pork belly. She'd bought the ingredients at the carbon market that morning. She showed me what she was doing as she went. Bay leaves, black peppercorns, the ratio of vinegar to soy sauce. She was patient about it. She'd promised to teach me, and she was teaching me. I watched and tried to be useful, which mostly meant staying out of the way. I never met Maricel. I didn't ask about her. I ate the adobo at a small table by the window, and it was genuinely better than what I'd eaten in the restaurant. Joy seemed pleased by this in a quiet way. She arranged a video call with her mother one afternoon. I hadn't asked for it. Joy suggested it. Said her mother wanted to say thank you for the medication. The call was on a phone with a cracked screen, the image breaking up slightly. An older woman in what looked like a small living room somewhere in Bohol. A framed Sacred Heart of Jesus on the wall behind her. She thanked me in English that was careful and formal, the kind learned from books rather than conversation. I said not at all. It was nothing, which is what I always say. Joy's mother smiled and said something in Cebuano to Joy. Joy answered, and they both looked at the screen for a moment. Then the call ended. I know I should have asked what was said. I didn't. In the evenings, back at my guest house, I looked at property listings on my phone. Not because I'd decided anything, just I wanted to know what it would cost. A one-bedroom condominium unit in Cebu, something decent, somewhere near the IT Park or the Ayala area, was going for anywhere between 3.5 million pesos and 6 million pesos. That's roughly 56,000 euros to 96,000 euros. Foreigners can own condo units in the Philippines, I'd read this, as long as the building is less than 40% foreign-owned. So it was possible, in theory, without putting anything in anyone else's name. I noted the numbers. I didn't show Joy. I wasn't ready to show Joy. Could I live here on 1,500 euros a month, I was wondering? My Irish state pension would eventually be about 1,100 euros a month when I turned 66, plus whatever the savings generated. Yes? Probably yes, if I was careful. More than careful enough if I didn't want to throw money around. It was the first time since Mara died that I'd thought past the next few weeks. The first time I'd done the arithmetic of a future rather than just the arithmetic of the present. I'm not sure I'd have recognized that at the time, but I do now. And then the phone call. It was the second to last evening of the trip. We were watching something on television, I have no idea what, some Filipino variety show, and her phone rang. She looked at the screen. Then she stood up and said, "Sorry, one moment," and went out to the small balcony and slid the door most of the way closed behind her. She was gone 20 minutes. Maybe a bit more. I watched the variety show and didn't watch it. When she came back, she said it was Roll. Something about his schedule for next semester. She sat back down. The program was still on. I looked at her face for a moment. Just a moment. She was composed. The same as always. Nothing to read there. I looked back at the television. I think about that moment. I've thought about it a lot since. The way she came back in and said Roll's name before I'd asked anything. I hadn't said a word. She offered the explanation before the question existed. And I filed it. Said nothing. He's watched the television for another half hour, and then said I should get some sleep. The flight home was early. She walked with me to the guest house and said goodbye at the door and said she hoped the trip home was smooth. I said I'd call when I landed. She said she'd be awake. I flew out the next morning before it was fully light. Cebu to Doha to Dublin. Somewhere over the Middle East, somewhere between the departure and the arrival, the thing that had been sitting quietly in the back of my mind started to make itself more apparent. It wasn't accusation. Not yet. Just a question. Just a joint I hadn't checked yet. And the particular discomfort of knowing that. I gave it 2 weeks when I got home. That's not nothing. 2 weeks of saying to myself, "You're tired from the flights. You're reading into things." The woman went outside to take a phone call, and that's the whole of it. People take phone calls. You're 63 years old, and you've been on your own for 14 months, and you are not in a position to be objective about this. I tried that line of thinking. It didn't hold. The thing about spending 40 years in the trade is that you develop a very specific relationship with doubt. On a scaffold, doubt is useful. Doubt is the thing that makes you check the fitting one more time before you walk away. The men who got hurt, and I knew men who got hurt, one badly, one worse than that, were mostly men who decided at some point that they already knew. that they'd done this 100 times and knew how it went. Familiarity as a reason to stop checking. I sat in the flat off the Ennis Road and I listed what I knew. She was consistent. A same room, same background, same routine, 7 months of it. She came to the airport. She took days off work to spend time with me. She'd arranged the call with her mother. She'd never asked directly for anything. The money I'd sent was modest in real terms. Medication and university fees and a motorbike repair. Things that were, individually, entirely plausible, and by any objective measure, not large amounts. Then I listed what I didn't know. I'd never met a single person from her life. Not one friend, not a colleague, not a neighbor. The friends she mentioned, a woman from work, a cousin who'd moved to Manila, existed only as names in sentences, never elaborated on, never available when I'd been there in person. The apartment we'd cooked in belonged to someone I hadn't met. The phone call was from her brother. She'd said so before I'd asked, and I'd let it go because I hadn't wanted to seem like a man who was keeping score. And I was keeping score. I just hadn't shown it. I thought about it the way I'd think through a rigging problem. Not emotionally, just structurally. What was I actually certain of? What was I taking on faith? Where was the load going? And had I actually tested whether the anchor points would hold it? The thing I kept coming back to was this. I had no way of knowing, from inside the arrangement, what the arrangement actually was. I could observe her behavior, and I could interpret it. But interpretation isn't inspection. You can look at a fitting and decide it looks sound. That's not the same as testing it. So I decided to test it. I thought about how you'd do it. It had to remove the specific thing that might be the only reason she was there. Not all at once. That would feel like an accusation. And an accusation gives someone the chance to perform innocence. It had to be something that sounded like bad luck, not a withdrawal of trust. Something that would make continued investment on her part irrational, if that investment had only ever been financial. I landed on the estate dispute. A cousin contesting mayor's will. There was an actual cousin, Padrek, who'd been difficult about the house sale for entirely mundane reasons, so the raw material was real. I just needed to extend it, make it a legal problem, make it something that would freeze the money for a long time, make it the kind of thing that you'd have to explain apologetically to someone you cared about and couldn't fix quickly. And I rehearsed it once, out loud, in the kitchen, on a Monday evening. I sat at the table with a cup of tea, and I said the words to the wall and listened to how they sounded. Not too dramatic. Matter of fact. The way I used to tell Mere that the oncologist had something he wanted to discuss, which meant it was bad news, and we both knew it. But you don't say that. You just say the words flatly and let the person understand them at their own pace. I called her on Tuesday, 8:30, as usual. She answered on the second ring. She was in her room, the crucifix on the wall, the small fan, the usual. She said hello. She seemed fine. She'd had a quiet day. I said I had some difficult news. I said I'd heard from my solicitor that morning. I said there'd been a complication with Mere's estate. A cousin who'd been difficult before was now formally contesting the will, claiming there were irregularities in how the property had been transferred years ago. My solicitor was saying it could take 18 months to resolve. Possibly longer. Until it was resolved, the estate was essentially frozen. I wouldn't be able to access the main funds. I said I was very sorry, that it meant I'd have to stop the monthly transfers for now, probably for quite a while. I said I was unlikely to be able to come back to Cebu anytime soon while this was ongoing. I kept my voice flat and quiet. I didn't rush. I gave it space. She didn't say anything for a moment. I counted. 4 minutes is an exaggeration. It felt like 4 minutes. It was probably closer to 90 seconds, maybe 2 minutes. But she was quiet for longer than I expected. Then she said she understood. She said she was sorry to hear it. She said she would be praying for me. She said God would provide. She said she had to go. Her shift was starting soon, and she needed to get ready. I said, of course. I said I'd be in touch when things became clearer. She said, okay. She said, take care of yourself, Brendan. We hung up. She sent one message that evening. It said she was praying for the situation to resolve and that she hoped I was okay. It was a considerate message. There was nothing in it to object to. Wednesday. Nothing. Thursday. Nothing. I checked WhatsApp around 11 in the morning and then around 9 at night. The last scene was from Wednesday early afternoon. She'd been on. Hadn't messaged. Friday morning I opened WhatsApp before I'd made the tea. And her profile photo had changed. I noticed it immediately. It had been the same photo for months. A picture of her in what looked like a church. Modest, slightly formal. Now it was different. A new photo. She was smiling in it. A full, proper smile. The kind and I realized this as I looked at it, I'm not sure I'd ever seen directed at me. Beside her, with his arm around her shoulder, was a man I didn't recognize. Younger, maybe early 30s. I sat with that for a while. I'm not going to tell you exactly how long. Then I put the phone down on the kitchen table and stood up and put the kettle on. I want to be careful about how I describe what came next. It would be easy to say I was devastated, or furious, or that I felt like a fool. All of those things had some truth in them. But they weren't the main thing. The main thing, sitting at that kitchen table with a cup of tea I didn't particularly want, was something closer to a very specific sadness about what the photo meant. Not what it meant about joy, exactly. About the thing itself. About the fact that the test had worked the way it was designed to work. I'd built the test hoping to be wrong. That's the honest version of it. I'd constructed the scenario, rehearsed the call, delivered the lines, and underneath all of it, I'd wanted her to message me on Wednesday and say, I've been thinking about what you told me, and I'm worried about you. Are you all right? I'd wanted her to behave the way someone would behave if the money was incidental to why they were there. Some part of me had genuinely believed she might. She hadn't. And the photo was unambiguous. She'd moved on, not gradually, not reluctantly, but by the following Friday, efficiently, with a new profile picture that suggested the next arrangement was already in place, before this one had fully ended. I thought about that for a while. The logistics of it. Whether there had been overlap, whether Brendan from Ireland had been one of several running simultaneously, or whether she'd simply been very quick about transitioning. I didn't know. I still don't. There are forums full of men who'll tell you it's always multiple, always simultaneous, that it's an operation, and you're just a position in a portfolio. Maybe, maybe not. I'm not in a position to say what was true for Joy specifically, and I'm not going to. What I could say, sitting at that table, was this. The relationship, whatever it had been, had not survived the removal of money. And that was the test, and that was the result. I did the numbers properly that day for the first time. Across 7 months, the medication transfers totaled 19,200 pesos. The university fees were 18,000 pesos. The motorbike repair was 6,500 pesos. Call it 43,700 pesos altogether. Roughly 700 euros. Plus the return flights to Cebu in October, which had cost me about 720 euros, and the accommodation and food during the 2 visits. The whole thing across the entire year, from the March trip to the last Gcash transfer, came to somewhere around 3,500 euros, maybe a touch more. Against 158,000 euros in a savings account, that is, I know it's not nothing, but it's also not a life-altering sum. I was not ruined. I want to be clear about that. The stories you see on the forums, men who've put 2 million pesos into building a house on her family's land, and then had the relationship end and discovered they own nothing because foreigners can't own property in the Philippines, I'd read those. And I was not one of those men. I'd gotten out for 3,500 euros and 7 months of evenings. I counted myself fortunate. I do count myself fortunate. But fortune isn't the same as good. You're not smart because the structure held. You're smart because you checked it before you climbed. I didn't contact Joy again. There was nothing to say that would have been useful, and I'm not a man who pulls at loose threads once he's decided the structure is condemned. She didn't contact me either, which I'd have been surprised by at this point. The WhatsApp stayed as it was. I didn't block her. I just left it. There was something that seemed right about that. Not maintaining contact, but not making a gesture of anger either. It had been what it had been. I wished her no particular harm, but I thought about her. I still do, occasionally. And I wonder about Roel and whether he finished his degree, whether the medication was real, whether the relationship she'd had with me had meant anything to her beyond its practical function. I think it might have. I think she might have liked me, in a way. I think she probably liked quite a few men, in a way. I don't think that makes her a monster. I think she was a woman in difficult circumstances, who had learned a particular set of skills for managing those circumstances, and I happened to encounter her at a point in my life when I was vulnerable to them in ways I hadn't fully admitted to myself. That's not generosity toward her. It's just accuracy. I rang Kieran eventually, about 3 weeks after the photo. Not to unburden myself. I'm not really built that way. But because he'd been the one who'd mentioned the Philippines in the first place, and it seemed right that he should know roughly how it had gone. I told him enough. He listened without interrupting, which I appreciated, because some people would have tried to tell me what I was feeling. He just listened. When I'd finished, he said he was sorry it hadn't worked out. I said, "Don't be." I said I came out of it intact, which was better than I had any right to expect. He said that was a fair way to look at it. We talked about something else after that. Normal things. My sister still doesn't know. That's fine. Some things don't need to be explained to everyone. The money is still in the account. I've not rebooked any flights. I'm not ruling anything out. That would be dishonest. And I went back to Mass about a month after it all finished. I don't know exactly why. Habit, maybe. Or the same thing I said before about needing somewhere to be at a specific time. I sit near the back. I don't take communion. I just attend. For the hour. It's enough. If you're watching this, and you're in some version of what I was in, if you're at the point where everything feels plausible, where the amounts are small enough to justify, where she's consistent and modest, and there are no obvious signs, I'd ask you one question. Not the questions the forums usually tell you to ask. Not about how often she calls, or whether she's asked for money. Just this one. How much of her life can you actually verify? Not what she's told you, what you've seen, who you've met, what you actually know, as opposed to what you've been shown. A scaffolder's job isn't to assume the platform holds. It's to check before you put any weight on it. Every time. No exceptions. The platform that looks solid from the ground can be the one that drops you 40 feet. You don't get a second chance if you skip the inspection. That's the whole of it, really. That's all I've got. And that's where Brendan's story ends. Back here at Inside the Philippines, it's worth saying plainly, he lost less than most men who get drawn into these situations. But the emotional accounting is harder to calculate than the financial one, and he'd be the first to tell you that. He spent 7 months building something in his head that turned out to have different foundations than he thought. And he's 63 years old, and he was trying to find out whether there was still a life available to him after a very hard few years. And the answer to that question is still open. He just knows a bit more now about how to check the structure before he trusts his weight to it. Not every relationship in the Philippines is transactional. Not every woman who asks for help with medication or school fees is running a scheme. Filipino family obligation is real, and the poverty that drives some of these situations is real too. What Brendan's story illustrates is that genuine feeling and financial dependency can coexist, and that when the money disappears, you find out very quickly which one was load-bearing. Whatever your situation, whatever stage you're at, know what you actually know. Not what you've been told, what you've verified. So thanks for spending time with us today on Inside the Philippines. If this story was useful to you, please subscribe. It helps us keep bringing these accounts to people who need to hear them. All stories on this channel are shared with the full consent of those involved, and names and identifying details have been changed. Take care of yourselves out there. We'll see you next time.